Okay, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and I have a very special show for everybody today. We have fellow Team Standing for Truth superstar Brandon here with us, who is going to be giving an epic presentation on Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's new book, Traced. This is the Traced book review by Standing for Truth Ministries. Brandon, Matt, what's going on, brothers?
Doing good. This is going to be exciting.
Same old stuff.
Awesome. Looking forward to this. Brandon, I appreciate all the fantastic work you've put into studying this book and putting together this important presentation. So before we get into it, though, I do want to go over why this is so important. And the question is, why is Dr. Jeanson's new book so important? It is because it provides amazing evidence for the recent origin of humanity. This book is yet another example of how young Earth creationists can make future testable predictions that end up being confirmed. And remember, these are novel predictions that can strongly help us differentiate between what? Between creation and evolution. Because using agnostic lines of evidence to help answer this question of ancestry is not going to help. And the gold standard of science is making future testable predictions that are, of course, falsifiable. And this new book, Traced, is confirmation of exactly that. In replacing Darwin, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson made numerous testable predictions based on the young Earth creation model of origins. Notice the title of replacing Darwin. It is titled Replacing and not Rebutting. Dr. Jeanson oftentimes points this out. This is important because young Earth creationists are not only refuting the evidence for evolution, but we are putting forth an even stronger model, the better model, a better alternative. Dr. Jeanson put very specific testable predictions in print. These can be found in Replacing Darwin. And one of them involves the history of civilization, as we have talked about frequently on this channel. This is because the history of civilization is primarily post-flood history. And so we should be able to detect genetic stamps and genetic signatures in our DNA that confirm post-flood history. And it turns out that this is exactly what we see. This is a fulfilled prediction based off the biblical model of ancestry. This has also led to an active research program where Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson will continue to discover more amazing truths about the history of civilization that traces right back to Noah's family just 4,500 years ago. The last thing I want to say is that Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has pointed out in a recent interview with Christopher Cernicke, he has said this book, Traced, doesn't defend biblical authority because it doesn't play defense. It puts biblical authority on offense because it's now meeting these standards that evolutionists have demanded and exceeding them. Again, Brandon, thank you so much for being here. Matt, thank you as well for being here as co-host. And Brandon, my brother, we're going to hand it over to you to kind of kick us off here with this talk.
I appreciate the intro. Fantastic introduction. And yeah, this book is pretty important, not just for people that share our views, but I think more importantly for people that don't share our views. And if they're at all concerned with the truth and they like digging into topics such as the scientific ones you guys present almost on a daily basis, then I think this book is going to be to their benefit, and they should definitely look into it. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right, you got that? You see Traced?
Yes,
Yep.
Looks good. I love that cover.
All righty. So here it is. This is the book by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, and if you don't know him, you should. If you don't, he did start his career with a bachelor's in molecular biology and bioinformatics. He then received his PhD from Harvard in cell and developmental biology. So this book, Traced, is basically some of what Donnie said, a sequel to Replacing Darwin, and the result of a research program that he started well back in 2009. And what he was doing, he was comparing proteins and genetic sequences from what he says about 2,700 different species of animals. But the further he got in that research, he showed just how impactful that could be if he applied these techniques to human ancestry and not just animals. So what he did is he set out to trace human history using certain genetic clocks. So the initial question he was looking at, when you look back into known recorded history, and we see specific major historical events, and one that piqued his interest was the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Now, this is very well documented, and what he proposed to do was look through genetic history and see if he could see a genetic signature that dated along the same times of that event with the people who were involved with that event. So if this hypothesis, we could say, could potentially be applied across all of human history, that's a pretty substantial claim. I think anybody can be on board with something like that. So Jeanson is a young earth creationist. He holds to a 6-day creation that takes place roughly 6,000 years ago. Now, this is totally different from what we're taught from secular society. This would be their model here. They call this the out of Africa model, originating in sub-Saharan Africa, where humans diverged, evolved out of an ape-like ancestor roughly 200 to 300,000 years ago. So the work Jeanson does, if you're at all concerned about certain biblical text, he does derive from the Masoretic text. And whether you're a proponent of the long sojourn or short sojourn in Egypt, that will make a difference in the timing, but not very much. It's not much to worry about. So this book's going to do a lot of things for a lot of people. It's going to saturate you and overflow your head with information. So if you haven't been interested or involved at all with the history of Jeanson's work, we're going to have to lay a little bit of the foundation again. And if you've heard this all before, you might be bored for a few minutes here. But to kind of see how this book tracks human history, my question when I was reading it is, how exactly did he get there? What test was he using? What was he looking at? And how can he make so many incredible specific claims for so many different people groups? So why does Jeanson use the Y chromosome? And this is where I'm going to ask you guys for a little bit of help. So what he wants to do is come up with a genetic time scale. In order to do that, genetics is the only way that we can determine who we came from. But not only that, it's going to tell us when we came from, where we came from, and who we came from. So what they do, they take samples of the Y chromosome DNA. And the reason they do test with the Y chromosome DNA, as many of you have heard many times over and over, both Donnie and Matt have talked a lot about the mitochondrial work that Jeanson did in his Replacing Darwin book. Rob Carter's done much similar work, but they look at the Y chromosome, which is about 60 million base pairs. Reliably, they can see about 10.3 million letters. Now, that's important because the total nuclear DNA is about 3.2 billion base pairs. And the Y chromosome doesn't go through recombination the same way that nuclear DNA does. So it's a little cleaner for them to look at. It's easier to line up and it's easier to test. Excuse me. So what they do, it's a very difficult, detailed process, but basically what they can do is in certain studies, they can take some DNA samples from a father, from a son. They can line these up and they can count the differences. Generally, what they see is about 3 mutations per generation, which is much faster than the evolutionists will lead us to believe here. So before we get into this tree, one more thing I was interested in reading this book is how they derived the clock. Because one way that the evolutionary camp would do it is by what's called a phylogenetic rate, which has multiple assumptions in it. But the way they calculate this Y chromosome clock is, we're going to use this quote here. So, quote, investigators must employ a version of the equation D equals RT, where D represents genetic differences, R represents the mutation rate, and T represents the time of origin. However, in decades past, biologists have had data only for D in this equation. Nonetheless, absent an empirical measurement of human mutation rates, Evolutionists calculated R by dividing known human genetic diversity into the evolutionary geology-based time of the origin of Homo sapiens, and referred to the result as the molecular clock. Obviously, this method derives values for R by first assuming a model-specific value for T, which represents a circular argument, if the goal of the argument is to empirically determine a value for T. So what they do is they assume a time to get the time. You don't have to be an amazing philosopher or mathematician or hold a high academic skill in logic to understand that that's just not going to work. So mutation rates have not yielded the true mutation rate, even though it is of critical interest. Most modern sequencing projects, like the 1,000 Genomes Project, from Rob Carter's article on Patriarchal Drive, they use high throughput techniques that create vast amounts of short sequence reads that then need to be run through sophisticated algorithms to produce an alignment. With a high enough coverage, sequencing errors can be averaged out, but very often low coverage data is instead compared to a standard. This provides great information for large-scale genomic features like inversions and large indels, but due to the inherent error rate of the DNA polymerases used to generate the short reads, it is impossible to infer the real mutation rate from the data. Some authors have gone so far as to use a fixed date in secular archaeology and then call it a sanity check for any mutation rate calibrations. So there's been a number of studies trying to calculate this Y chromosome clock we talk about. A pair of studies from 2009 and 2015 reported results consistent with an evolutionary timescale. The issue with these studies is that they were taken with very low coverage data, which obviously resulted in low coverage or low quality results. We know that the evolution timescale is incorrect, and this book shows exactly that. But another pair of studies, one in 2015 and 2017, they showed a 10-fold higher mutation rate with quality DNA, and they showed the ancestry of humans to be less than 10,000 years old. Another interesting point is this 2017 study repeated the high-quality DNA testing, but they left out the Y chromosome data. I wonder why they did that. So what Jensen did, he went and he pulled the raw data out of that study. And when he looked at that data, it was consistent with a 4,500-year timeline for male ancestry. Now, the reason we have a 4,500-year timeline and not the original 6,000 like we started out with is because that takes us back to the most recent bottleneck of humanity, which was the global flood of Noah's day. So one thing I want to make note of that I learned from reading this book is that people groups in the past didn't randomly mix, as evolution will have us assume. They're very tribal, and they were separated not just by geographical boundaries, but cultural boundaries and language barriers. So the further we go back in time, the less people were around, therefore less options for procreation. But there's a mathematical impossibility in our family tree unless we start connecting the trees at some point. So what you can see here in these phylogenetic trees we have in the screen here, color plate 12 and 13. Now these are directly out of the TRACED book. If you keep going back in time, so like you will have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. You can keep going back in time with this. So in the book, he gives an example of this, what he calls a mathematical impossibility of a theoretical Sioux warrior born in 900. So applying the simple math of doubling, and he provides a generation time of 25 years. In the year 125, he would have 2 billion ancestors, which vastly exceeds the total population of the entire globe. So because of this, our family trees are required to connect at some point, and it might be a lot sooner than we think. So in mathematical terms, the Y chromosome tree has billions of branches right now. And if we go back 400 years, 95% of them are gone. They connect and represent a very recent history. Another thing to take note out of this book is Jensen explains that like the phenotypic traits we see today, meaning the physical appearance that people have, they may not have always been what we see. So simply looking at someone doesn't tell you exactly where they came from, and where people live now doesn't give you the slightest clue where they came from either. What he means by this is that just because you have a certain skin tone, that may not have always been the case in your ancestry. So another thing this book does, as a side note, is totally destroys anybody's belief in racism. There isn't multiple races on Earth. There is one race, just the human race. So what we can look at is what's called a Punnett square. So this is going to give us a visual. It's a genetic visual, and this is going to tell us what the probability is that a child's skin tone would look like given the genetics they receive from mom and dad. So as you can see, it's not going to take a long time to alter phenotypic traits like skin tone in a family tree or population. You can even Google right now mixed ethnicity parents that have twins of mixed ethnicity. It happens not all the time, but it does happen. And so obviously phenotypic traits don't take thousands and thousands of years to be surfaced. He does present a mathematical model in this book, as we know a lot of critics like to point out the fact that if you want to be taken seriously, you need to provide some math to what you're talking about. In the mathematical model he presents, he uses the Islamic African slave trade. Now, this is different than the more well-known and talked about transatlantic slave trade. The Islamic slave trade hit the same amount of Africans, roughly 11 to 12 million, but instead of voyaging across the sea to the Americas, the Islam conquest used slaves over a period of 1,200 years, from 600 to 800, and enslaved twice as many women as men. So here's his example. In Europe in 1975, the population was roughly 635 million, which he notes is a tenfold increase since 1400. So if 10 million slaves were added to the European population in 1400, they would have accounted for 14% of the population of 70 million. From 1975 to 1400, that was 575 years. And again, given his generation time of 25 years, that's 23 generations. So if Africans would have a, let's say, 13% higher birth rate, which he notes earlier that Europeans have a birth rate that will not replenish the population, but the Muslims did have a higher birth rate that would produce more offspring. So after those 23 generations, 575 years, the Africans would end up accounting for 75% of the European population. So it seems like the European population would be mostly dark-skinned, but that really wouldn't be the case. So this is where his math meets this Punnett square. At first, the overwhelming majority of the population was light-skinned, and after generations of mixing, the Punnett square tells us that there would be a loss of the dark-skinned, a slight increase of middle brown, but eventually the light skin would take over. If you want a little bit more on this, if no one has seen it, Answers in Genesis, they have a 25-part series that Nathaniel Jeanson did over the pandemic lockdowns. And if you go to part 4, he talks about that quite a bit. So what's the point? The point is that an ethnic group can enter a family tree. They can end up dominating that family tree and hardly leave a visible trace because of different reproductive rates. On top, a prediction is made available, which Jeanson makes about the mutation rate of the longest African branches. Now, we'll see this in some of the graphs later. And he says that these men either have faster mutation rates now, they could have faster mutation rates in the past. Rob Carter adds that it could be from a defective DNA repair enzyme or selective sweep across the population. These things might sound a little technical, but if you're a person that likes to dig deep, these are some things you can keep looking into. Things like patriarchal drive, inbreeding. Africa could have started with a larger population size from Noah's descendants, or maybe a higher recombination rate due to the PRDM9 gene, which again, Matt and Donnie have talked in length about. So far, this is just a little bit of groundwork behind the method that Jeanson's used in this book, because these are some of the questions I had. How is he deriving all this data? Because it is extremely detailed, and it's not detailed just here or there. It's detailed across the globe through all of history, and it's only going to keep getting better. So I want to show you something else and the beginning of the book. So this is a map of mostly Africa here, and this is a haplogroup named E1B1B. So what they did is they took genetic samples from men all across the map you can see here. And these circles represent a percentage of men that hold this E1B1B haplogroup. So of all the Egyptian men tested in this group, they represented about 40%. So the question here was, where did this group originate? So as we test these men in the present, where did they come from in the past? So as Jeanson works through his phylogenetic trees, through all this genetic data, lost my spot. He's able to place dates on these phylogenetic trees, and we can explore how he does a little bit later. But this specific group, the E1B1B, they split around 300 to 600 AD, and they give rise to the North Africans. The people they split from ended up in East Africa. So before the split, before these groups split, they must have had a common ancestor occupying the same geographical space. So in order to answer the question of where the group come from, you got to have a little more information here. So some historic events help and language barriers help. So we know that prior to 600, political control was mostly Roman. It shifted to Asia. And around the year 600, Muhammad began to expand the Islamic empire. And the split of the E1B1B group just so happens to occur right at the time of that Muslim conquest. Which you'll see right here. So another piece of information he's going to use to support this split and make a little more sense of it is linguistics. So what you're seeing here is a distribution of Indo-European languages. This obviously does not overlap with these men. So what he's going to show you next are the Afro-Asiatic languages. And you see the distribution is eerily similar to the E1B1B. The Middle East and Africa are united by this Afro-Asiatic language family, which allows for the mixing of people groups. So the overlap here is evidence for support of Jeanson's data. The geographic distribution of E1B1B overlaps the languages spread by the Arab Muslim conquest. So all of North Africa through the Arabian Peninsula and even in India. He does point out why the overlap isn't perfect. And for that explanation, the short story is due to Turkish rule that took place later after the Mongols, but more details in that in the book if you want it. We won't go through that right now. So what we've seen in just a couple little pictures, a couple slides here, a little bit of background information. We've got multiple lines of evidence supporting one another for the phylogenetic trees he presents in the book. And they've been constructed from language family distribution, political conquest, religious conquest, and it's all well documented in history. We know exactly when these things happened. And the deviation he has in his phylogenetic trees, another point to be made, is basically based off of the difference in the biblical text. And it's only a couple hundred years, so it's really not anything to worry about. So as you can see here, the distribution of this haplogroup falls directly over the Afro-Asiatic languages. Okay, so this data is replicated with another haplogroup, E1B1A. Now, this group dominated sub-Saharan regions of Africa, originating in West Africa, and they spread to the south areas, the oldest in lineage belonging to West Africa. So they mostly speak from the Niger-Congo language family and share a common ancestor around the 1200s to 400s. They had a big separation in the 1600s that sent many into southern Africa. The explanation of the separation and dispersal of this group has a great explanation having to do with the transatlantic slave trade that started in the 1500s. So this was one of the original questions Jeanson had when he started looking at this genetic history, is could he see the genetic signature of a major historical event that we know a lot about? And that's exactly what he saw here. So he goes through a bunch of data. He offers suggestions possibly where the E1B1B and E1B1A common ancestor arose from. Now, these groups connect back in the 700 to 400s BC. So using a little bit of logic, he goes through the map, the origination of the groups from the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula for the east, West Africa for the west. And if you kind of connect these groups, the most plausible and logical location for their origination is probably somewhere around Sudan or Ethiopia. So when we see a lineage split like that, it should be rather obvious that at one point, the groups had occupied the same geographic location. And this is a spot where there was a lot of activity going on. It was very popular for trade routes. And he goes into the Axum, I believe, around that area, Sudan, Ethiopia. So, I mean, the claims he makes in this book are not just so stories or shots in the dark. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, and I'm only barely even scratching the surface on a couple things here. But these genetic splits, they line up with historic events. They line up with the linguistic families. They line up with migration patterns. They line up with the topology of the regions he's looking at. If we go a little bit further back in this history, we see these E groups meet up with the AB group. So this takes history back pretty close to the flood, and not a whole lot is known about this time. A lot of genetics haven't been tested yet, specifically to that point. But based on the topology, again, okay, the desert area, the Africa being surrounded by water, much of the history has already been covered. Egypt seems to be the prime choice for the origination into Africa, not the origination of all people, because before these groups split into Africa, their ancestors are found in the East and Asia, descendants of Ham. So we've got multiple lines of evidence that blatantly contradict the evolutionary story of the ancestors of all humanity coming out of sub-Saharan Africa. What Jeanson shows in this book is that they don't come from sub-Saharan Africa. They eventually migrate to sub-Saharan Africa, but they came from more than likely around Egypt. I got a lot more notes here. We're not going to go too deep in the weeds, but just a quick summary here. We've got the E1B1B, E1B1A. This is mostly North and East Africa, mostly West. They split probably somewhere around Sudan, Ethiopia. And around these points in time are when the Axum, the Axum split. And you've got the Muslim conquest in here. All these different historic events are lining up right with Jeanson's timeline, right on his phylogenetic trees, and they all make sense of geography and migration. So one quote I really love that Jeanson makes in this book, he says, "In short, my timescale is working. It has made and is making testable predictions that have been fulfilled and are being fulfilled. It meets a decades-old standard that mainstream science has put in place for extraordinary claims. It also happens to find independent corroboration in the rest of our DNA. The maternally inherited DNA, mitochondrial DNA, also has a clock that ticks off just a few thousand years of history. The history embedded in the DNA that we inherit from both parents also finds confirmation in multiple independent lines of evidence. I claim that future studies will reveal even more branches that go deeper in the tree. In one of my published papers, I put this prediction in precise mathematical terms." If you want to see that, that's on page 525 in the book. This we can probably talk about in a minute, but a really cool graph you'll get in this book. So this is the phylogenetic tree of all the studies he got information from. And what you can see here are the three sons of Noah and the dispersion of people throughout the globe. I think it's pretty fantastic information. This obviously took a lot of work, a lot of time. And there's some major details that are going to perk the ears of the critics when they start diving into these phylogenetic trees because of where Jeanson places the root. I know that's been a question amongst a lot of them. In the supplements he provides in the book and on his website, he shows you exactly where he places the root, not only here, but in the studies where he derived this data from. Another feature to point out here is what you can see that the Greeks don't come from Shem. Okay. The Egyptians don't come from Japheth. There's no overlapping in any of these branches. There are three major lineages that are distinct here. And it is so clear when you arrange the data according to a biblical time frame. Now, if you arrange this data according to a evolutionary timeline, you do not get what we see here. So what we see here is a graph of population size, the global population size based on like historical data, archaeology. And you see this nice, what they call a hockey stick pattern. Now this yellow portion here, that's Y chromosome data. Oops, sorry. When this Y chromosome data is placed on a biblical time frame, that overlap between known population size through historical data overlaps with the Y chromosome data at about a rate of 95%. Now, if you do this with the evolutionary timescale, you're lucky to get 27%. So I'd like to say that Jeanson's model is just a little bit better. Is there anything you guys want to add at this point? Any comments on anything we've covered?
I do have quite a bit to add, Brandon. It's been a fantastic presentation so far, but I think what I'll do is wait until the entirety of your presentation is finished, and then I'll kind of give a recap because you said so many good points here. I'll just wait till the end for myself. Matt, what about you, brother?
Same. I'm taking notes as well. So,
well, here's another graph you guys will see in the book, as well as anybody else that buys it. Which this is substantial. These are impressive claims, and they come from not a whole lot of genetic data. I mean, we're only talking maybe a few thousand lines of genetic samples, and we're looking at roughly somewhere between 3 and 4 billion men on the planet. But from what Jeanson's taken out of these studies, you can see the clear separation between Noah's 3 sons. You can see the dispersals of these people all across the globe. And we can basically trace our lineage back now. If you were to go get your Y chromosome tested, he could tell you right now what son of Noah that you came from. I think that's pretty impressive. So at the back of the book, you'll see this graph. And this might be really small. You guys might not be able to read this, but he basically gives the major Y chromosome haplogroups here. And all you have to do is flip back to the book, look up your Y chromosome, and he'll tell you exactly who you come from. A little bit of the history, the chapter, you can find it in the book, and a whole bunch of more information. So what I want to conclude with, what I take out of this book more than anything, is that the Bible is the key to the past, not the present. And we can wrap it up there.
Awesome. Great. I have a couple questions then. Does the book at all mention that there might even be a part 2 to Traced?
Part 2 is going to be the rest of Jeanson's career. This is never going to end because the more data he gets, the more thorough the book is going to get, the more predictions that are going to come, the more it's going to confirm biblical creation.
Got it. And for people that really like the generational patterns that bit broken down, we read in Scripture that there was a miraculous event that took place where the languages were divided. Does the book cover any of that aspect?
Oh, absolutely. So the Tower of Babel is mentioned, the Table of Nations through Genesis 10, Genesis 11. It's all in the book. You're really going to want to read that part. I didn't want to give too much away. We just wanted to cover some foundational stuff and not get too deep in the weeds. But just wait till you guys get this book. It's impressive.
Awesome. So, you being a fan of all of this type of information, how would you rate the book yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, let's say?
5. There's not enough stars to fit in that. This is one of the, like Jensen says, this is probably the strongest positive apologetic for biblical creation that's ever been in print. That's a substantial claim. And I don't disagree with it, because when you are claiming you can trace all of human history back to the most recent bottleneck, which would be the flood for us, confirming that much history, and then he can take us back to Noah's 3 sons. Who else is going to top that? How are you going to top that?
Good point. Good question.
Well, if I could, and great questions, Matt. And again, Brandon, brother, fantastic presentation, such great work. And I love seeing this team, put so much work, time, and energy into defending the truth. And this book is a major game changer, as you're putting it, Brandon. And one thing I want to make clear to those watching is the critics have all failed to address this data, okay? They criticize and yet fail to make better testable predictions, and they fail to present an alternative and more superior model. They are grasping at straws, and it is obvious. And Dr. Jensen has made that point in several of his interviews and discussions pertaining to this book. And Brandon, I'm sure you know what I mean. In all there is criticisms and complaints, but yet not a more superior model being presented. And that's the point. Predictions made in replacing Darwin are now being confirmed in TRACED, showing that, yes, we can indeed detect these genetic signatures and genetic stamps in terms of the history of civilization as predicted and expected based on the young Earth creation starting point. Brandon, what are your thoughts on that, brother?
You hit the nail on the head there. Criticism is great, and especially internally and externally. So I would like to address anybody who wants to be a critic of the book. If you want to attempt to debunk Jensen's work, you're not going to be able to do so by just poking a small hole in this. If you want to debunk this book, you yourself have to, like you said, come up with a model that replaces TRACED. So there's a book title for any of you critics: Replacing TRACED. Good luck.
Yeah, we won't be holding our breath for that one. You nailed it there. Yeah, you can poke holes all day, which, unfortunately we've already seen. And as we like to point out, very unsophisticated. Good luck coming up with a book titled, Replacing TRACED. Not going to happen. Yeah, exactly. I'll buy it for sure. And a couple things here I want to point out, gentlemen, is based on the data. I'm going to reiterate a couple points here because there's so many good points to reiterate. Excuse me, Brandon. Based on the data that you presented throughout your presentation, including what you discussed and what we frequently discuss, the molecular clock data that has led to these predictions, right? And confirmation of those predictions. Specifically, the Y chromosome is really what we're dealing with here. And the mitochondrial DNA, which we've got hours and hours worth of video and discussion on, that is also amazing confirmation of the biblical model of ancestry. But specifically here, the Y chromosome. This uniparentally inherited DNA compartment has led to these fulfilled predictions. And we can test if the world family tree is a record of long periods of time, as you've put forth here, Brandon, also known as deep time evolution, right? Does the molecular clock data, let's say the Y chromosome phylogenetic tree that we oftentimes put forth, and even when it comes to mitochondrial DNA phylogeny, do these really go back a couple 100,000 years? Or do they only go back thousands of years, let's say 4,500 years? Two competing models. The evolutionary model, which would say, no, this is a reflection of thousands of generations. the young earth creation model, which says only hundreds of generations. These critics, they want to poke holes, but they don't want to test their model. And I'm going to go back to this. We can then test if the world family tree is a record of long periods of time or a shorter period of time, the young earth creation model. Well, this 4,500 year history of young earth creation is true should be stamped all throughout the Y chromosome in the form of genetic signatures. And that's what we've discussed here. And that's what this book is all about. These critics, they complain about what? Mutation rates. We've dealt with those. They formulate arguments based on pedigrees versus substitution rates. We love that as well. Always fun to debunk. But most importantly, again, they all fail to make better testable predictions. And the entire point we have made all along, and Dr. Jensen is making, is that if this data really is consistent with the young earth creation model and let's say view of the molecular clock data, then we should be able to make these predictions. And they've been made. And as Jensen, Dr. Jensen is showing here, they are being confirmed. Okay. And it really is fascinating that this global Y chromosome tree is the key to human history. And Dr. Jensen is detecting all kinds of genetic signatures in relation to historical events in the Y chromosome, which I'm sorry, critics, this is confirmation of predictions made in replacing Darwin that these critics have tried to poke holes in. And yet they're still trying to criticize something that we're way beyond now. We've moved past your criticisms. Okay. We are in the realm of fulfilled predictions now. Okay. So the last thing I'll say, because you put it perfectly, Brandon, is it's time to come up with a better model. And we're not seeing that. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Yeah, I think that every young earth creationist should pick up Dr. Jensen's work, whether or not it's from the very basics of replacing Darwin, made easy, made simple, whether it's watching some of the videos that are put out, or when you get advanced, getting this, because it's going to not just strengthen your own faith, but it's going to be able to help others around you as well. It's going to bring confidence that young earth creation is verifiable. You have the ability to test it and make predictions and have arguments that when you come into contact with people, that you are able to reiterate some of the arguments that are made by Dr. Jensen, because they are some of the absolute best in the business. If you learn Dr. Jensen's model, you can hold your own literally in any debate. And that's what I really like about his work.
Amen. Well said. I got something to share on screen, Brandon, unless you had a couple points you wanted to make, brother.
No, have at it.
Okay, here we go. We got about 15 minutes left. We're going to try and keep this an hour. And that way, everybody in the audience, we want to encourage you to share this around. Okay, we want as many people as possible to, see this and share it with people, because it's important data. So again, I wanted to kind of go over the gold standard. Okay, and why it's so important. And here's an article. We've gone through this before in the past, but I just find it funny that even before the book itself was released, there have been papers and studies that Dr. Jensen has put out that have gone untouched, essentially. And here's one: evidence for a human Y chromosome molecular clock pedigree-based mutation rates suggest a 4,500 year history for human paternal inheritance. Okay, and you talked about these high quality sequencing data versus the low quality, and now we're looking at a very fast mutation rate in the Y chromosome, and the number of DNA differences, essentially, as I think this nicely lays out. In this current study, the authors note that if humans have actually been around for several thousand years or more, they should have accumulated 8 to 59 times the amount of mutations that we currently observe in the Y chromosome DNA sequence. Remember, every single human male Y chromosome on the planet, nearly identical. And that's why we can take the Y chromosome diversity worldwide and build these nice family trees. And given the fast mutation rate and the low variation, there's only one conclusion that can be made. That's that this DNA compartment is young. And of course, the evolutionists have the rescue devices. And our counter argument is the fact that testable predictions have been made. And guess what? They've been confirmed based on the biblical model of ancestry starting point. They should have accumulated 8 to 59 times the amount of mutations that we currently observe in Y chromosome DNA sequence. However, the researchers in this current study empirically demonstrate that we only observe about 4,500 years of mutation accumulation in the paternal ancestry contained in the record of the human Y chromosome. Again, right here, testing the predictions of the young Earth Y chromosome molecular clock. Population growth curves confirm the recent origin of human Y chromosome differences. These have not been addressed. So again, going back to the gold standard, because it is so incredibly important, I did want to cover this before we wrap it up. Dr. Jensen points out, when I wrote the book Replacing Darwin in 2017, this was the standard I sought to meet. Replacing Darwin contains numerous testable predictions. One in particular, right? Because this is the one we're focusing on. But as people know who watch this channel, we focus on numerous testable predictions. One specifically being DNA function based on the created heterozygosity model, but specifically here on the history of civilization. The YEC anthropology that I just outlined makes another prediction. Since my model traces the origin of nearly all the common DNA variants back to Adam and Eve, my model suggests that the history of civilization can be read off of the nuclear DNA differences. One category of DNA differences, right? We also have other DNA compartments, of course, among the peoples of the globe, and on a time scale consistent with the YEC model. For example, in the last few hundred years, European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade have resulted in major geographic movements of peoples around the globe. These movements will leave, notice this, will leave. Okay, these are very specific predictions that Dr. Jensen's making. Another very specific prediction he's made has to do with mutation rates in people groups whose mutation rates have not yet been measured. I mean, come on, critics. It's time to step up and play ball. These movements will leave a signature in the genetics of each of these peoples. I also articulated these claims with respect to a specific type of nuclear DNA that is inherited only in males. The Y chromosome, right? This uniparentally inherited DNA compartment passed down from the male side, right? I got my Y chromosome from my dad, and of course, my son got his Y chromosome from me. Thus, both the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome sequences have the potential to act as strict absolute molecular clocks. The rate of mutation in each of these compartments will determine how precisely each can measure time. But the fact of a clock is true in both compartments. Therefore, the timing of the origin and migration of various people groups, this is it again, can be interrogated with these genetic tools. The Y chromosome differences among modern humans represent, in theory, the first type of nuclear DNA signature of the history of civilization. I'll wrap up here. Notice this. Since then, I've published not one, not two, but 3 papers that directly confirm these predictions for the Y chromosome. And the critics are silent. All the critics are doing is repeating already debunked talking points and yet failing to provide a better and more superior model. It's time to step up, guys, because it's not looking good for the critics. I'm sorry if I sound aggressive, but it's 2022 and it's a great time to be a young Earth creationist. With this precedent in hand, in spring and summer of 2020, I began to explore the global ramifications of these findings. I looked for the signatures of human history in the DNA of people all around the globe. You can find the results of this early search in a video series, which I highly recommend. Very technical series and also very important. Since airing the initial results in a video series, I've been working intensely on the remaining signatures of human history in our DNA. The results have been stunning, and we've seen the results here thus far. This is going to be a lifelong project for sure, which is amazing. An active research program based on the Young Earth Creation starting point, and these results have been seen here and presented by Brandon in the book Traced. For example, we know that most people of European descent came from Central Asia in the AD era. Also, much of sub-Saharan Africa looks like it's linked to ancient Egypt. Modern Polynesians might also have their origins in ancient Africa. And this is everything about the book right here. Effectively, this book fulfills. I mean, the critics pretty much have to just say, you know, Dr. Jensen's making this up. We're making this up. No, that's not an argument, guys. This book fulfills the testable predictions I made several years ago. Okay. Meeting the decades-old demands of the evolutionary community. They set the standard, and now they're not meeting their own standard. And Matt, I know you're going to like this one, brother. So this is the last thing I'll say, and then we'll get your guys' thoughts here. This one's funny. Common criticism from these critics, especially the militant critics who don't want to tap out. He, referring to a very specific critic who likes to repeat arguments that have already been addressed. He claims I misunderstand the substitution rate. This is Dr. Rob Carter responding, per year versus the mutation rate per generation. Yeah, I just find it funny how like these critics, a lot of the times, you gentlemen understand and have seen it. You know, they will as an argument pretty much accuse, you know, PhD biologists and geneticists of, you know, not understanding these things. I mean, like some of these they're not even addressing the arguments. Well, they're not understanding this. And as Dr. Carter points out, I am perfectly well aware. Okay, you know, Dr. Jensen, Dr. Carter, Dr. Sanford, they understand these things. All right. It's just, it's really bizarre that these types of arguments these critics are putting forth. I am perfectly well aware that the long-term substitution rate is not the same as the genealogical mutation rate. However, okay, so the misunderstandings actually come from the critics, which is funny. Over long periods of time in a population in mutation to drift equilibrium, the two are nearly equal. There is also not, as he claims, and probably continues to claim, a conflict between the thought that A, most mutations are lost due to drift, and B, that the mutation rate is approximately the same as the fixation rate. Why? Because even if most mutations are lost in a large population, many are not. This is basic population geneticists. And right here is so true of a lot of these critics. Okay, pay attention to this. They know not of what they speak. And it has become absolutely clear. And I'll wrap up with there, gentlemen. What are your thoughts?
No, I love it. I've been like you. I've seen the look on their face when they're looking for arguments. You know, that's why I think they ignored the Y chromosome data so much, because there's wiggle room with the mitochondria mutation rates, and we know that they can look to specific isolated islands where inbreeding has occurred and selection might remove some, and they can go, ha, look, no mutations popped up, right? And then they can go, see, there's your discrepancy. They're just looking for little tiny holes like mentioned earlier, but they can't do that with this one. See, the mitochondria being small makes it very hard to count mutations up, because you don't get a full mutation every generation. But the Y chromosome makes it very easy to count, because you get more than one every generation. So that's why they don't like dealing with this data, because they don't have that wiggle room anymore. So I do have another question for Brandon, though. And I noticed that a lot of people in general, even not young Earth creationists, don't really know so much about what to do with Neanderthal. They're kind of confused. Are these pre-flood people or these post-flood people? And I wanted to know if TRACED mentions or brings up Neanderthal and answers any of those questions.
TRACED does mention it, but it's very brief. It's not as thorough as some people might like. And I think I know why, is because we know that Neanderthals were a isolated inbred people group, and they were in the distant past a few thousand years ago. Because of that, we know that DNA degrades very quickly. Therefore, taking words from Jensen's mouth, he would say that DNA is not very reliable. It's degraded to a point that he's not getting 100% accurate results. So when he places Neanderthal in these phylogenetic trees, if you remember earlier when I said that when you place these on the evolutionary timescale of hundreds of thousands of years, you can only capture about 27% of history. When you do it with Neanderthals, you're only going to capture about 14%. So it's much worse. And it's not because they're non-humans. It's because they're humans, but the genetics we have from them are degraded and not very reliable. Not reliable enough to the point where they fit in with the modern data we have. So I would say that's probably why he doesn't go into that much detail. And I mean, you guys have talked extensively about that topic, and so have other ministries as well, like Rob Carter and those guys. So there's not a lot of info, but I think it's about chapter 13. He mentions them a couple times, but very little.
Okay, that was really all I had. I just wanted to throw that in there for the audience. They love Neanderthal.
Which is why you and I, Matt, a couple weeks ago, we did the most comprehensive presentation on Neanderthals that you could find on the internet. So I'd recommend that if people want 3+ hours of nothing but Neanderthals and refuting the critics on Neanderthals, please definitely check that out, as it is not an issue for Dr. Jeanson's model. That's for sure. So that's all I have. Looks like that's all that Matt has. Brandon, again, great job, great work. Love the presentation. We highly recommend the book Traced. And again, it's a great time to be a young Earth creationist. Brandon, I want to hand it to you, brother, for some final words, final thoughts.
Well, I mean, we only covered a fraction of this book today. It didn't take a whole lot of time, but this book is like 200 and some pages of text, another 200 pages of these different kinds of charts and graphs and trees and information from all over the globe. And it's not just Africa in this book. That was only a portion, but I mean, you're getting information for Europe, Central and South Asia, the Middle East. Jeanson has a really good idea on where the Jewish lineage is. I know that might excite some people as well. He talks about China, Pacific regions, Vikings. That's pretty cool. The history of the Americas, pre-Columbus. So there's just so much in this book. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend people study it. And like Matt said, if you want to start small, get the Replacing Darwin Made Easy. Maybe go on to AIG, Answers in Genesis. Check out the research journal. Pull up Nathaniel's technical papers and read through those. If you don't know some of the words, Google them. Learn what you can. But he's got such a wealth of information. It's really going to benefit your apologetics exponentially. I can't recommend it enough.
Awesome.
Amen. Well said, Brandon. Again, great job. Great final points. And I really look forward to having you, on these streams more often. And if anybody's wondering, yes, Brandon is he's the superstar when it comes to our templates and thumbnails. So this is the guy right here. And Brandon, keep up the good work, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. Share this around, as it is so important. And just watch as, of course, the critics fail to present a more superior model. Thanks for tuning in. Standing for Truth is out.